Here we go.
Last year I made this post about how I viewed Sanji, Zoro, and Luffy in power relative to each other. And at the beginning of this year, I did a video talking about their offensive abilities. So you can check that out. It was done in January, but we're going to continue the series now.
That's right.
Because I figured it'd be a good time to get this in while I'm gonna have a very busy October this year, because I'm gonna go for the first time in my life, Japan trip. Woo! Yeah! So I figured it'd be a good time to kind of plug in some of this stuff now to try and finish what I started 8 months ago. That video in January was about the offensive capabilities of the monster trio and their strength, their attack power, and their DC, what they can destroy. This video is about the defensive attributes of the monster trio, their durability, their endurance, and their stamina. I kind of threw stamina in there because I said, why not? Not a big deal. Just how it's not a big deal for you to support your boy's content with that thumbs up. Hit it! Yeah! These stats I did for the monster trio are pretty old stats because obviously it's about December last year and January at the beginning of this year. So there are changes I would like to make as of today, which is the end of September 27th. And the first thing I do want to do is once again change the offensive stats. January, I did make changes with Luffy, Zoro, and Sanji, and I lowered Zoro and Sanji relative to Luffy. And I would double tap that again in terms of attack power. So the attack power of Zoro, I would now say is a 5 relative to Luffy, and I would say the attack power of Sanji relative to Luffy would be a 4. However, after some thought, I do now definitely want to raise the strength of Sanji to a 6. Nani? We'll keep Zoro at a 5 and Luffy at a 10. The German physical buffs that Sanji gets during Onigashima are just too tremendous, and I have to give leeways to those physical buffs. So I know off the gate, I got a few guys on tilt. I'll dive into that in more detail later on in this video, since obviously for defense, these German buffs will matter a lot. But for this main theme, when it comes to stat change for defenses, I wouldn't do anything other than actually raise Zoro's stamina to a 6 or 7 now because of the recent Rob Lucci fight he had. Let's dive into this category first then. For the defensive stats of durability, endurance, and first up is stamina. And for transparency's sake and accuracy's sake, I do lean with the manga first and foremost, the primary canon material. I have Luffy at a 7, Zoro at a 6, and Sanji at an 8 when it comes to stamina compared to one another. Zoro, during the Lucci fight, fought for a long time off screen. It was shown that he did use the King of Hell at one point in time, but then didn't have it on later on in the fight. So it's safe to say that Zoro's time using the King of Hell extended compared to his Wano Country version, which was excellent. That's great, which is why he has now that stamina point increase. But because he didn't have King of Hell on for the entire fight, I then cannot say that he can put it on for the whole fight or a long duration. It goes against the idea that Zoro can use the King of Hell continuously for hours at a time. And if he tries to do that, he'll probably risk a lot of self-harm, like what he notes to during his fight against King the Wildfire in chapter 1035. Oda has to tell us or show us that Zoro can use the King of Hell for a long period of time without that self-harm before he can get that medal. I do not give out participation trophies. He has to earn that medal, and the same thing goes for Monkey D. Luffy. Luffy has shown the ability at base form to fight against someone like Katakuri for several hours and take a beatdown. And yes, it is true that he did take a break in the middle of that fight. He literally left the battlefield and then came back later on. But even after that break, the hours still continue. So that is very impressive. And you would think, okay, hold up then, King. Sanji doesn't have hours of fighting like Luffy against Katakuri, so why is Luffy under Sanji for stamina? At peak performance, Luffy hasn't shown the ability to fight for long periods of time without needing to restart or risk lifespan. Assumingly, that's what he was kind of doing when he restarted his Gear 5 in the second final part of the Kaido fight on the rooftop, where Kaido says, "You're gonna die," And then Luffy says, I don't really care. But as they fought against Kizaru, we do see Luffy needing to consume food in order to restart his Gear 5 on Egghead Island when he's trying to fight against the Elders. And here you have Dory and Brogy. They give Luffy some sort of like ration. And then even when he's on the ship, he's eating all this food before going to Gear 5 in conjunction with Bonnie Gear 5 Light. So Luffy always needs that sort of sustenance to get him going. This is the reason why Sanji, in terms of stamina, is better than Zoro and is better than Luffy. Because as far as we know, those signs of fatigue with Sanji and his power of love, the German powers don't exist. Compared to Zoro, who could risk his own life, and compared to Luffy, that may have to use lifespan or has to get tapped out because he needs food. During Egghead Island, he did use power of love time in and time out and time in and time out, but never was he ever like fatigued the same way Luffy was when Luffy went Gear 5 time in and time out, time in and time out. Though to be fair, Sanji did pass out after the Queen fight, but it's left ambiguous to the readers and the viewers as to why he passed out. There was a whole battle that Sanji was going through physically, obviously, while his body was for the first time transforming into that German form, and obviously he was going through a lot of mental anguish as well. So all these plays a factor, ideally, therefore you just can't pinpoint on the stamina usage of his German ability, unlike Zoro and Luffy, who directly know to their abilities issues. After stamina, we have endurance. And I have Luffy and Zoro at a 10 out of 10, while I have Sanji at a 9 out of 10. Just to be clear here, endurance meaning how much pain and damage, both physically and mentally, a character can tolerate. So altogether comes to mind as someone like Whitebeard, where Whitebeard doesn't have a body like Big Mom, but he has a massive stat sheet for his endurance feats, and they're off the charts because he took so much damage and still kept on fighting and still kept on plowing forward. Now, Sanji has shown incredible endurance of the entire series of One Piece. After he fought against Bon Chan, Bon Clay in episode 116 or chapter 189, he did break a few bones, but he could still help out the crew afterwards to try and stop the ongoing battle in the Alabasta capital. He fought against Virgo on Punk Hazard with an already heavily damaged body after Nami was inside of his body, and when he got his body back, Sanji immediately collapsed. But even still, with the body that was already battered and bruised, he could fight against Virgo. And even after Virgo cracked Sanji's shin, with that fractured shin, Sanji could still fight. Even before fighting against Jabra, remember, Sanji got beaten up by Khalifa, so he went into that fight against Jabra far from max, which is another testament to Sanji's incredible endurance and his pain tolerance. So Sanji does have the feats, and I would argue his best stretch of endurance feats comes in Thriller Bark, where in Thriller Bark, for a period of time, he has to hold up Nami and make sure that she doesn't get hurt, while Absalom is laying in these haymakers with his enhanced, souped-up hogback physique. And then after that situation, he even fights against Oars Luffy 1v1. He is the first person in Thriller Bark to fight against Oars Luffy 1v1 in chapter 470, episode 365, and got decimated, of course, by Oars Luffy, but still joined the group fight and took the group fight damage during that whole raid boss situation. He starts off the raid boss battle against Oars Luffy at 50 or 40% HP, and everything else he literally has to endure like the rest of the Strike crew. That includes the Ursurus shock. So Sanji has an amazing string of endurance feats in Thriller Bark. And we did touch on the idea already of the mental anguish that he suffered during the entire Queen fight. If you know someone that has a mental condition, a mental breakdown, Alzheimer's, dementia, these conditions in many ways are far more stressful and taxing than physical ailments. You're losing yourself. Your brain is what you are. And Sanji felt like he was at risk of losing himself because of his German powers awakening. But those are more ambiguous to actually kind of gauge in terms of mental endurance. But even still, despite all those things I just said, I would say that Zoro has better endurance than Sanji. Zoro is known for being an endurance goon. He thrives off of endurance. And his main claim to fame is what? Taking Luffy's pain at the end of Thriller Bark. So even though Sanji got back up from the Kuma Ursurus shock throughout the entire arc before that point in time, taking way more damage than Zoro did, because Zoro didn't take any damage, as far as I recall, against Ryoma. But Zoro, like the other Straw Hats, did take a beating to take a big beating from Oar's Luffy. But what's more important in this situation is the fact that Zoro took Luffy's pain, which includes Luffy's fatigue and stress. So Luffy was absorbing in 100 shadows for Nightmare Luffy, which was extremely stressful on his body and taxing on his body. Most folks can only handle 2 or 3 shadows. Luffy took 100 shadows. So the mental and the physical anguish of that was pretty damn high. On top of that, to beat Gecko Moria, he combined Gear 2 and Gear 3 into the giant jet shell. And this is, at the point in time in the story, a huge deal for Luffy's body and how damaging it is to himself. And all of that pain, all of that fatigue, Zoro accumulated. Zoro took in. Nuts. Zoro was already in a weakened state, and it is a miracle that he survived that. So while it is true that he wasn't the same for the rest of the pre-time skip, think of Shibondi, where he was more exhausted during that fight compared to Luffy and Sanji. The fact of the matter is that he survived taking Luffy's pain. It was so impressive that even Kuma, with his buccaneer body, said in chapter 1102 that even he may have passed out from that sphere of pain. A guy that literally is built to tank and tolerate pain, because we see how much pain he takes in from the elderly and so on a regular basis. Furthermore, after the Big Mom and Kaido combo move, he broke a lot of bones in his body. And in chapter 10-12, Law tells Sanji that Zoro broke around 20 to 30 bones. But even after the combo move, Zoro could still fight. Albeit not for long, because again, he had like over 20 broken bones, but he could still continue to fight. And that is another extraordinary moment of Zoro's endurance. So Zoro, in terms of endurance, I do give him the edge over Sanji. Luffy is also a 10 out of 10 too, because compared to Zoro, even Luffy's feats of endurance might be better. Though it's hard to say exactly, because in a fight, things tend to be the case where Sanji has an easier time, then Zoro has a much harder time, then Luffy has an extraordinarily hard time when it comes to the strongest, second strongest, and third strongest of an opponent's crew. Sanji has an easier time fighting against Queen than Zoro King, than Luffy Kaido. Luffy... So when it comes to fights and endurance, the level of opponent does matter. But Luffy's best endurance feat, I argue, doesn't come from a fight. But it's what happened in Impelled Down, surviving Magellan's poison. Luffy lost years of his life while enduring the Ivankov healing hormones. Originally, Eva said it was going to be 10 years of his lifespan lost in chapter 538, but he did finish within a day, so I don't know if that means that he lost more years or less years. It's unclear. However, Luffy, for 20 hours, was undergoing grueling pain and bodily changes to survive that poison. There's even a pool of his own blood oozing out from under the door. So One Night at Eva's is no joke. It'll be a great horror game, absolute. But Luffy does get food immediately to recover from some of that damage he took in that 20-hour span. So let's say, coupled with amazing feats during fights, like let's say standing back up from Rob Lucci's 6-gun cannon before he does that final jet Gatling, even doing the elephant Gatling on the Noah Ark while sustaining massive blood loss, Luffy has proved himself to be phenomenal in endurance. And on a quick note for Sanji, Sanji's best endurance feats in the story mostly come from battle, whereas the Luffy and Zoro, you could argue with Kuma's pain, and again, Luffy with Impelled Down, they're not. However, Sanji does have 85 days of starvation, damn near, on that desolate rock when him and Zeph were trapped there. Some folks may argue that is Sanji's best endurance moment, but I think it's too hard. It's too difficult to actually correlate that moment when he was a kid to the Sanji of today. But right now, I would say it is close enough between Zoro and Luffy to where they can both earn a 10 out of 10 in endurance. And I would say the same principle applies to Luffy and Sanji in durability, but in another way. So currently for durability, I have Luffy at a 10, Sanji at a 10, and I have Zoro at a 6. Durability meaning how tanky a character is, meaning they take either no damage or they take very little damage from attacks. That can apply to mental attacks as well. If you notice, during Wano Country, both Luffy and Sanji get huge physical stat buffs. 1045, Luffy, he eats a Kaido club and his body morphs to the spikes on Kaido's club. And so he negs a lot of that damage. And in Luffy's case, he might, big might. This is a huge, like all might, okay? We're talking about, I am maybe not here, might be able to neg damage completely in a Looney Tunes fashion, like what we see in chapter 1111, where his eyeballs, his scar, and parts of his body go flying off like Mr. Potato Head or something when Warcry does his hockey yell. So Luffy's durability could be insanely, really, massively busted. But hold on, you have Luffy and Sanji to 10. How? There's a catch. Luffy's durability, insanely, massively, what the F busted, except for cutting attacks. Whether it's normally or in Gear 5, that weakness is still there. He can use Haki, true, absolutely. He can use Haki to block the cutting attack, but it depends on his timing, how strong is the cutting move, what kind of Haki Luffy is using to guard that move. So for example, is he using regular armor Haki? Is he using more advanced stuff, let's say with the barrier? It all depends, right? But Luffy has to actively guard for those sort of attacks. However, Sanji doesn't have this weakness. Far from, since Queen's Sword snaps once it hits Sanji's neck. Sanji is literally checked out. He's not even focused. And the sword snaps on his neck, whereas Luffy would have to actively dodge or defend against that attack. And based on Queen's statement in chapter 1029, it looks like what Sanji did was beyond the scope of what armored Haki can do. Someone like City of the Rain, who could stab Garp with Haki and go through his body, could likely do the same thing to Luffy if he's caught slipping. But if it's Sanji with the power of love, that would be far less effective. So Sanji's tankiness and defense goes beyond eating a punch from the Seraphim casually, or let's say a light speed kick from Kizaru in chapter 1108. He will keep plowing through most of that damage, irrespective, for the most part, irrespective of the type of damage that's coming his way. Of course, physical, mental, spiritual, whatever. But physically, it doesn't necessarily matter what kind of damage it is. So even though Luffy's ceiling for durability is higher than Sanji's, he has a glaring weakness in that durability. But Sanji does not have any such weakness. Meanwhile, Zoro's defenses are very, very good, but not compared to Sanji or Luffy's. When Luffy and Sanji are transformed into their German power of love and in their Gear 5 states, they passively get massive physical boost. Sanji gets an exoskeleton, and then Luffy gets what the F Toonie stuff. And their thresholds for how much damage they can take spikes to an absurd extent. But Zoro has to actively time his Haki usage for defense from oncoming attacks. Case in point, in chapter 1033, Zoro almost dies. It's when Zoro stabs King, and then King says jackpot, and then there's a huge explosion over the entire area. He says he survived because he put up his Haki in time to block from that explosion. However, on the flip side, when Zoro fails to have his Haki up in time, he can take some pretty huge hits. Like for example, in chapter 937, when Killer / Kamazo, when his scythe goes right through Zoro's shoulder. The endurance feat of taking that damage to the shoulder and then powering through Onigiri, phenomenal. But that's endurance. That shoulder attack was not 0 damage, far from. It was big damage, huge damage. And Zoro later on does pass out because of that, and he's hungry. Not because of any poison stuff that folks said, that's a lie. He took a big shot from Killer / Kamazo at that point in time, and he was hungry. Now, this would not happen with Sanji. Even if Sanji was slipping, Kamazo's attack would have done nothing to Sanji, and his own scythe probably would have shattered. And then on the flip side, when it comes to King and Zoro's situation, if Luffy was caught slipping with, let's say, the jackpot move, he would literally, unironically, just say, "Ite!" And then he would spin around like a drill, and he would remove the soot from the jackpot move. That's how it would be with Luffy, unironically. Sanji and Luffy just have much higher thresholds than Zoro does. And there might be a case here where passively Zoro is getting better defense when he uses the King Hell State, because folks would say, okay, well, Luffy is calling himself in Conqueror's Haki when he fights against Kaido on the rooftop. But the problem is that it's stated to us directly by Kaido that Luffy can do that. Luffy is a far superior Conqueror's Haki practitioner than Zoro is. And during that fight against King the Wildfire in 1035, the only attack Zoro takes full on is just a kick to the face from King. That's it. And then even still, will that compare to the Sanji German body and Luffy's Gear 5? Even though Luffy's calling himself in Conqueror's Haki and Armor Haki, his best thresholds for durability are still based on his Gear 5 physique. Sanji can stack his Armor Haki on top of his Germa body for added defense, but the highest thresholds for his defense are still with the Germa body. So we have to see a lot more feats of what Zoro could potentially take when he's in King of Hell form, if it does actually increase his defense. So on that note, that is how I see defensively the difference here between Zoro, Sanji, and Luffy. Let me know your stance on the subject matter at hand. Once again, if you enjoy boys' content, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and click on that bell to join the notification squad. I'm gonna catch you guys and gals on the flip side.
See you. Bye-bye.